History of agrarian reform in the Philippines. Pre-colonial times, before 16th century, land was commonly owned by the community known as barangay. This is a small unit of government consisting of 3,100 families administered by the chiefs. Everyone in the barangay regardless of status had access on the land and mutually shares resources and the fruits of their labor. They believed and practiced the concept of stewardship, where relationship between man and nature is important. Land cultivation was done commonly by Cajun system, or the slash and burn method, wherein land was cleared by burning the bushes before planting the crops, or either land was plowed and harrowed before planting. Moragta's code seems to be the only recorded transaction of land sale during this time. This tells us about the selling of the Panay Island by the natives to the 10 Bornean datus in exchange of a golden silicate and a long gold necklace. Spanish era. 1521 to 1896, the colonial government at this period introduced a pueblo agriculture, a system wherein native rural communities were organized into pueblo, and each Christianized native family is given a 4 to 5 hectares of land to cultivate. The pueblo agriculture practiced no sharecropper class or landless class. The native families were merely landholders and not landowners. By law, the land assigned to them was the property of the Spanish king, where they pay their colonial tributes to the Spanish authorities in the form of agricultural products they produced. Through the laws of the Indies, the Spanish crown awarded vast tracts of land to with friar lands for the religious orders, frepatillamentos for lands granted to the Spanish military as a reward for their service, and encomienda, large tracts of land given to Spaniards, encomendero, to manage and have the right to receive tributes from the natives tilling it. Natives within these areas became mere tillers working for a share of crops. They did not even have any rights to the land. Abusive encomienderos collected more tributes that became the land rentals from the natives living in the area. A compras y vendalas system was practiced wherein tillers were made to compulsory sell at a very low price or surrender their agricultural harvests to Spanish authorities, where encomienderos can resell it for a profit. People of the encomiendas were also required to render personal services on public and religious work, and as a household help to the encomienderos. The Spanish crown made a law in 1865 ordering landholders to register their landholdings. Only those who were aware of these decrees benefited. Ancestral lands were claimed and registered in other people's names, Spanish officials or local chieftains. As a result, many peasant families were driven out from the lands they have been cultivating for centuries or were forced to become tillers. As more tillers were abused, exploited and deprived of their rights, the revolution of peasants and farmers in 1896 articulated their aspirations for agrarian reform and for a just society. Women also fought for freedom and played an important role in the planning and implementing the activities of the revolutionary movements. The revolutionary government confiscated the large landed estates, especially the friar lands, and declared these as properties of the government. Malolo's Constitution, 1896, Article 17. American ERA, 1898 to 1935, realizing that being landless was the main cause of social unrest and revolt at that time, the Americans sought to put an end to the miserable conditions of the tenant tillers and small farmers by passing several land policies to widen the base of small landholdings and distribute land ownership among the greater number of Filipino tenants and farmers. Philippine Bill of 1902. This law provided regulations on the disposal of public lands, wherein a private individual can own 16 hectares of land, while the corporate land holdings can avail of 1,024 hectares. This also gave the rights to the Americans to own agricultural lands. Some 400,000 native farmers were without titles at the start of the American era. This situation was also aggravated by the absence of records of issued titles and accurate land surveys. To remedy the situation, the Torren system was then introduced to replace the registration system implemented by the Spaniards. Homestead Program of 1903. This program allowed an enterprising tenant to acquire a farm of at least 16 hectares to cultivate. However, the program was not implemented nationwide and was introduced only in some parts of Mindanao and northern Luzon, where there were available public alienable and disposable lands. There was no limit on the size of land holdings one could possess. Land holdings were once again concentrated in the hands of fewer individuals who can afford to buy, register, and acquire fixed titles of their properties. Hence, more lands were placed under tenancy. There were widespread peasant uprisings, headed by the armed peasants groups known as Colorum and SUBTITLES of Luzon and northeastern Mindanao respectively. These uprisings resulted to social disorder in 1920s and 1930s. Hence, more militant peasants and workers' organizations bonded together for a more collective action against the abuses of landlords and unjust land ownership situation. This gave birth to the Communist Party of the Philippines. Commonwealth years, 1935 to 1942, the government under the stewardship of President Quezon realized that land reform programs should be implemented immediately. They saw the purchase of friar lands as a possible way to solve the problem of inequitable land ownership. They also saw that the homestead program could be transformed into a massive resettlement program if properly implemented. Japanese era, 1942 to 1945. During this occupation, peasants and workers organized the Hukbalahap, Hukbong Bayan Laban Samgavhapan, on March 29, 1942 as an anti-Japanese group. They took over vast tracts of land and gave the land and harvest to the people. For them, the war was a golden opportunity for People's Initiative to push pro-poor programs. Landlords were overpowered by the peasants, but unfortunately at the end of the war, through the help of the military police and civilian guards, landlords were able to retrieve their lands from the Hukbalahap. Government initiatives on agrarian reform. Manuel L. Quezon, 1935 to 1944. President Quezon laid down a social justice program focused on the purchase of large haciendas which were divided and sold to tenants. This administration was responsible in establishing the National Rice and Corn Corporation, NARICC, and assigning public defenders to assist peasants in court battles for their rights to till the land. Budget allocation for the settlement program made it impossible for the program to succeed. Widespread peasant uprising against abusive landlords continued. In addition, the outbreak of the World War II put a stop to the land ownership and tenancy interventions during this period. Manuel Roxas, 1946 to 1948, Republic Act No. 34 was enacted to establish a 70-30 sharing arrangement between tenant and landlord. The 70% of the harvest will go to the person who shouldered the expenses for planting, harvesting and for the work animals. President Roxas negotiated for the purchase of 8,000 hectares of lands in Batangas owned by the Ayala Zabal family. These were sold to landless farmers. However, due to lack of support facilities, these farmers were forced to resell their lands to the landowning class. This failure gave basis to doubt the real meaning of land reform program. Elpidio Quirino, 1948 to 1953. Through Executive Order No. 355, the Land Settlement Development Corporation, LASADECO, was established to accelerate and expand the peasant resettlement program of the government. However, due to limited post-war resources, the program was not successful. Ramon Magsaysay, 1953 to 1957, President Magsaysay realized the importance of pursuing a more honest-to-goodness land reform program. He convinced the elite-controlled Congress to pass several legislation to improve the land reform situation. Out of the targeted 300 haciendas for distribution, only 41 were distributed after its 7 years of implementation. This was due to lack of funds and inadequate support services provided for these programs. Landlords continued to be uncooperative and critical to the program, and land ownership and tenancy problems continued. Carlos P. Garcia, 1957 to 1961, there was no legislation passed in his term, but he continued to implement the land reform programs of President Magsaysay. Diaz das do Macapagal, 1961 to 1965, President Diosdado Macapagal was considered the father of agrarian reform. It was during his term that the Agricultural Land Reform Code RA No. 3844 was enacted on August 8, 1963. This was considered to be the most comprehensive piece of agrarian reform legislation ever enacted in the country at the time. This act was piloted in the provinces of Pangasinan, Bulacan, Nueva Ecija, Pampanga, Tarlac, Occidental Mindoro, Camarines Sur and Misamis Oriental. It acquired a total of 18,247.06 hectares, or 99.29% out of the total scope of 18,377.05 hectares. The program benefited 7,466 farmer beneficiaries. BLAD-DAR official records. Ferdinand E. Marcos, 1965 to 1986, Presidential Decree No. 27 became the heart of the Marcos reform. It provided for tenanted lands devoted to rice and corn to pass ownership to the tenants and lowered the ceilings for land holdings to 7 hectares. The law stipulated that shared tenants who worked from a landholding of over 7 hectares could purchase the land they tilled, while shared tenants on land less than 7 hectares would become leaseholders. This agrarian reform program was designed to uplift the farmers from poverty and ignorance and to make them useful, dignified, responsible and progressive partners in nation building. This Arkansas program was a package of services extended to farmers in the form of credit support, infrastructure, farm extension, legal assistance, electrification, and development of rural institutions. What were the 5 major components of President Marcos's agrarian reform program? FLAN tenure program, institutional development, physical development, agricultural development, and human resources. President Marcos's agrarian reform program was labeled as revolutionary by some sectors. For 2 reasons: it was pursued under martial law and intended to make quick changes without going through legislative or technical processes, and it was the only law in the Philippines ever done in handwriting. Scope of program was limited only to tenanted, privately-owned rice and corn lands. Foreign and local firms were allowed to use large tracts of land for their business. Declaration of martial law leading to the arrest of several farmer leaders without due process of law due to suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Corazon C. Aquino, 1986 to 1992. Various sectors recognized agrarian reform as a worthwhile social investment. In terms of the tenant-tiller status, this improved particularly those within landowners' retained areas or on landholdings subject for coverage. It's during this administration that the present adjudication system was introduced. This gave DAR the original and exclusive jurisdiction over agrarian disputes as quasi-judicial powers. Also, livelihood and agro-industrial projects promoted and program of support services were intensified to help farmer beneficiaries become productive and transform them into entrepreneurs. This administration received much support and active involvement in program implementation from key stakeholders such as People's Organization, Farmers Association, NGOs, and from prominent landowners themselves. Despite the Agrarian Reform Fund, ARF, this administration experienced a major budgetary shortfall due to low remittances from the Asset Privatization Trust and the Presidential Commission on Good Government. This administration also experienced constant changes in DAR leadership. This led to lack of continuity of priority, programs and projects. Allegation on lack of political will's leadership and genuine commitment to implement the program. Critics say that the president could have implemented a genuine agrarian reform program because of her revolutionary powers after People Power I. Fidel V. Ramos, 1992 to 1998. The Ramos administration is recognized for bringing back support of key stakeholders of CARP by bridging certain policy gaps on land acquisition and distribution, land valuation, and case resolution. It is also credited for enhancing internal operating systems and strengthening the capabilities of the DAR bureaucracy. This administration is also credited for tapping more resources to help implement the program. Failure in enforcing the installation of some farmer beneficiaries on awarded lands became an issue for this administration. Critics say that non-physical installation of FBs has been the norm rather than the exception. Some sectors also complained on the slowness of this administration in the acquisition and distribution of privately owned lands. Although this administration was credited for having the biggest accomplishment in terms of land, critics say this is because the land acquired and distributed were more on public lands and rice and corn lands. Joseph Ejercito Estrada, 1998 to 2001. This administration saw the urgency of land distribution and believed that it can be served if it is built on farmers' capacities to pursue their own development. One of the first things this administration did was to rework performance targets by focusing on the number of hectares of land distributed coupled with an accounting of farmer beneficiaries and the specific croplands and farm systems covered. This approach sought to integrate land distribution and support services. It was during this period that DAR launched a series of land occupations by working with farmer claimants, the LGU and government security forces. Fiscal constraints encountered by this administration resulted to unpaid or delayed payment of landowners covered under the compulsory acquisition and vote schemes. There were also issues on and intra-ARBS conflicts due to arguments for control over negotiations with prospective joint venture partners, some of which became violent. President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, 2001-2010. The GMA administration has adopted the Bayan-Anitan concept as the implementing framework for CARP. Bayan means people, Anitan means harvest, and Bayan-Anitan means working together. Applied to CARP, Bayan-Anitan means a united people working together for the successful implementation of agrarian reform. This administration is also credited in heightening agrarian case resolution by introducing a quota system to compel adjudicators to work faster on agrarian cases and train farmers into paralegals. Benigno C. Aquino, 2010 up to present. Under the governance of President Aquino, the DAR, which is the lead agency for CARP implementation, is bent on sustaining the gains of agrarian reform through its three major components: land tenure improvement, LTI, program beneficiaries development, PBD, and agrarian justice delivery, HAD. Together with the efforts to fight graft and corruption by the president, it is imperative to have institutional reforms within DAR as a complement to the above-mentioned DAR components, as well as give credence, transparency and accountability at all sectors of the DAR bureaucracy.